February 13, 1981, 28,000 feet above Lebanon's Bekaa Valley. A Syrian pilot pulls back on his throttle, pushing his MiG-25 Foxbat to Mach 2.35. He is invincible. Soviet instructors told him so. Nothing can catch him. Nothing can touch him. He is flying the fastest interceptor ever built, a titanium demon that makes Western fighters look like toys. Then his cockpit explodes. Two American-made Sparrow missiles launched from an Israeli F-15 he never saw tear through his aircraft at 3.5 times the speed of sound. The engagement lasts 37 seconds. The Syrian pilot never fires a single shot. He never even knows he is under attack. This is the moment a 15-year lie dies in a ball of fire over Lebanese airspace. For 15 years, the Soviet Union told the world their MiG-25 Foxbat was unstoppable. Western intelligence believed them. The Pentagon spent billions preparing for a fighter that turned out to be made of welded steel and vacuum tubes from the 1950s. NATO generals lost sleep over an aircraft that flew like a freight train and could barely turn. But here is what nobody expected. The man who would expose this lie was not a CIA spy, not a brilliant American engineer. He was a 29-year-old Soviet pilot named Viktor Belenko, stationed in the frozen wasteland of Siberia, who woke up one morning and decided he had enough of living a lie. His defection would hand the Americans the greatest intelligence gift of the Cold War. And 5 years later, Israeli pilots would use that knowledge to destroy the myth of Soviet air supremacy in seconds. This is the story of how propaganda created a monster, how one desperate man revealed the truth, and how American engineering buried Soviet aviation doctrine under a mountain of burning wreckage. The fear began in 1967. American intelligence analysts sat in darkened rooms at Langley, Virginia, staring at grainy photographs from Soviet air shows. What they saw made their blood run cold. A massive twin-tailed fighter larger than anything the West had ever built, screaming across the sky at speeds that seemed impossible. The Soviets called it the MiG-25. NATO gave it the codename Foxbat, and Western analysts gave it capabilities that existed only in their nightmares. Look at the size of that thing, they said. It must be made of titanium, like our SR-71 Blackbird. Look at those engines. It must have thrust-to-weight ratio that would let it dogfight with anything we have. Look at that radar dome. It must carry electronics decades ahead of our technology. United States Air Force Secretary Robert Seamans called it probably the best interceptor in production worldwide. The Pentagon began redesigning American fighters to counter a threat they did not understand. Defense budgets exploded. Engineers worked around the clock to match capabilities the Foxbat never actually possessed. The Soviets watched this panic with quiet satisfaction. They released carefully edited footage showing Foxbats climbing vertically, accelerating to Mach 3, reaching altitudes where American fighters could not follow. They published articles in military journals praising the aircraft's advanced technology without providing a single technical detail. It was the greatest bluff in aviation history. And for 15 years, the Americans fell for it completely. The truth was far less impressive. Soviet engineers had built the MiG-25 not to fight Western fighters, but to intercept one specific threat, the American B-70 Valkyrie bomber. This Mach 3 nuclear bomber was designed to penetrate Soviet airspace at 70,000 feet too high and too fast for existing Soviet defenses. Chief designer Mikhail Gurevich faced an impossible problem. He needed an aircraft that could reach Mach 3 and climb to 80,000 feet. But Soviet industry could not produce enough titanium. Soviet engines could not generate enough thrust without melting. Soviet electronics could not match Western capabilities. So Gurevich did something Western analysts never imagined. He cheated. Instead of titanium, he used nickel steel, cheap, heavy, and easy to weld, by workers with minimal training. Instead of sophisticated avionics, he installed vacuum tubes that belonged in a 1940s radio. Instead of a maneuverable fighter, He built a flying missile platform that could go fast in a straight line and do absolutely nothing else. The MiG-25 weighed 81,000 pounds fully loaded, making it one of the heaviest single-seat fighters ever built. Its flight manual specified maximum G-loads of just 2.2 at high speed, because pulling harder would permanently bend the steel airframe. Test pilots described it as flying a freight train on rails. It could not turn. It could not dogfight. It could only go straight and fast. But the Soviets did not care. The B-70 bomber flew straight and level. It did not need to be chased. It just needed to be intercepted and destroyed before it could drop nuclear weapons on Moscow. There was just one problem. The Americans canceled the B-70 program in 1969 after building only 2 prototypes. The Soviets had spent a decade building hundreds of interceptors to counter a bomber that would never come. Instead of admitting their mistake, they doubled down on the lie. While Soviet propagandists polished the Foxbat myth, a young pilot named Viktor Ivanovich Belenko was discovering the truth the hard way. Belenko was born in 1947 in Nalchik, a small city in the Soviet Caucasus. His father abandoned the family when Viktor was 2 years old. His mother worked multiple jobs to survive. Young Viktor grew up in poverty, but he had one burning ambition to fly. He joined the Soviet Air Force in 1971 and was assigned to the 513th Fighter Regiment in Chuguyevka, a frozen base in the Soviet Far East near the Chinese border. When he learned he would fly the legendary MiG-25, he felt like the luckiest pilot in the Soviet Union. That feeling lasted exactly 1 week. The cockpit instrumentation looked like something from a World War II bomber. Mechanical gauges with needles that stuck, warning lights that flickered randomly, a radar so primitive it could barely distinguish aircraft from ground clutter. The hydraulic systems leaked constantly, leaving puddles of fluid on the hangar floor every morning. Belenko learned that maximum afterburner endurance was measured in minutes because the engines consumed fuel faster than any aircraft in history. He learned that engine overhauls were required every 150 hours because operating temperatures degraded the metal constantly. He learned that the flight controls became nearly immovable at high speed, requiring superhuman strength to make even gentle turns. Most disturbing of all, he learned that everything Soviet instructors had told him was a lie. The MiG-25 was not the most advanced fighter in the world. It was a desperate compromise built from cheap materials by underpaid workers, using technology the West had abandoned decades ago. The pilots knew this. The engineers knew this. The commanders knew this. But nobody could say it out loud, because criticizing Soviet technology meant prison or worse. Belenko spent 5 years flying an aircraft he knew was inferior, defending a country he had stopped believing in, surrounded by lies he could no longer tolerate. On the morning of September 6, 1976, he made his decision. The escape plan was insane. Belenko would take off on a routine training flight break, away from his formation, descend to 100 feet above the Sea of Japan, to avoid radar detection, and fly 400 miles to Japan on whatever fuel remained. If he ran out of fuel, he would die in the freezing ocean. If Soviet fighters caught him, he would be shot down. If Japanese air defenses mistook him for an attacker, he would be killed before he could explain. The MiG-25 was never designed for low-altitude flight. At 100 feet, fuel consumption would triple. The heavy steel airframe would become even harder to control. One mistake meant instant death. But Belenko had stopped caring about survival. He cared about truth. At 1 p.m. local time, Belenko climbed into his cockpit for what his commanders believed was a routine training mission. He carried something strictly forbidden, the aircraft's complete technical manual, hidden in his flight suit. If the Americans were going to understand the Foxbat's weaknesses, they would need documentation. He took off with 3 other pilots from his regiment. For the first 20 minutes, he followed the standard flight plan, perfectly turning where he was supposed to turn, maintaining formation as trained. His squadron mates suspected nothing. Then, at the far end of the training circuit, Belenko did not turn back toward base. He pushed his nose down and dove for the ocean. By the time his commanders realized what was happening, Belenko was 50 miles away, skimming the waves at 100 feet, invisible to Soviet radar. His squadron mates pursued him, but the MiG-25's poor low-altitude handling worked in his favor. They could not catch him before he crossed into Japanese airspace. Belenko climbed periodically to show himself on Japanese radar, desperate to avoid being shot down as an unidentified intruder. Japanese F-4 Phantoms scrambled to intercept, but poor weather and communication problems prevented them from locating the Soviet defector. He had planned to land at Chitos Air Base, the only military airfield shown on his map, but weather forced him to divert to Hakodate Civilian Airport. The runway was 6,500 feet long. The MiG-25 needed every inch of it, and then some. Belenko deployed his drag chute and stood on the brakes. The aircraft screamed down the runway tires, smoking finally sliding to a stop 800 feet past the end of the pavement. When Japanese police arrived, they found a Soviet pilot climbing from the cockpit of the most feared fighter in the world. He had 30 seconds of fuel remaining. "I want political asylum in the United States," he said, "and I have brought you a gift." The gift was everything. For 67 days, American and Japanese engineers disassembled the MiG-25 piece by piece, photographing every component, measuring every dimension, testing every system. What they discovered destroyed 15 years of intelligence estimates overnight. The aircraft was not made of titanium. It was welded steel crude construction that would not pass quality control at an American automobile factory. The radar used vacuum tubes that belonged in a museum. The avionics were 20 years behind Western technology. The flight controls required physical strength that bordered on the superhuman. CIA analysts issued a classified assessment that fundamentally rewrote everything America believed about Soviet aviation. The MiG-25 was not a technological marvel. It was a paper tiger, an aircraft designed to destroy a threat that no longer existed, built from materials chosen for cheapness rather than capability. Belenko, granted asylum by President Gerald Ford, provided testimony that made the technical analysis even more devastating. He described fuel systems so inefficient that combat air patrol measured in minutes. He revealed maintenance problems so severe that half the Soviet Foxbat fleet was grounded at any given time. He explained that Soviet pilots received minimal training because fuel was too expensive to waste on practice. The myth was dead. But the killing blow was still 5 years away. The information Belenko provided went directly to Israeli intelligence, and Israeli Air Force planners studying the data realized something extraordinary. The supposedly invincible Foxbat was not just vulnerable. It was a sitting duck for pilots who understood its weaknesses. The F-15 Eagle, America's newest air superiority fighter, could detect the Foxbat at ranges where the Soviet radar saw nothing but static. Its missiles could hit Mach 3 targets the Soviets believed were untouchable. Its pilots, trained in beyond visual range combat, could kill without ever entering the arena where speed mattered. Israeli pilots began preparing for an engagement that Soviet doctrine said was impossible. But the Syrians flying their Soviet-supplied Foxbats over Lebanon with impunity had no idea what was coming. They still believed the lie. And in Part 2, we will witness the moment that lie dies, not in intelligence reports or classified assessments, but in a ball of fire over the Bekaa Valley. We will see Israeli F-15 pilots execute tactics that Soviet engineers declared impossible. We will watch the greatest air combat massacre in jet age history unfold in real time. The kill ratio will be 82-0, and the Soviet Union will never recover. In Part 1, a desperate Soviet pilot named Viktor Belenko stole the most feared fighter in the world and handed it to the Americans. For 67 days, CIA engineers tore apart the MiG-25 Foxbat and discovered a 15-year lie. The invincible interceptor was made of welded steel and vacuum tubes. It flew like a freight train. It could not dogfight. It could not even turn. But knowing the truth was one thing. Proving it in combat was another. The Soviets had spent 15 years building the Foxbat myth. They were not going to let one defector destroy it. Syrian pilots continued flying their MiG-25s over Lebanon with absolute arrogance, photographing Israeli positions, daring anyone to stop them. And here is where things got complicated. The intelligence Belenko provided was classified at the highest levels. The Americans could not simply announce to the world that the Foxbat was a paper tiger. Doing so would reveal their sources and methods. It would tell the Soviets exactly what they had learned. It would compromise future intelligence operations. So the truth remained locked in classified files, while Syrian Foxbats continued violating Israeli airspace with impunity. Israeli Air Force commanders faced a maddening situation. They knew the MiG-25 was vulnerable. They had the intelligence. They had the aircraft to exploit it, but they could not act without revealing what they knew. Every overflight was a humiliation they had to swallow in silence. General David Ivry, commander of the Israeli Air Force, sat in his office at Tel Aviv headquarters, staring at reconnaissance photographs. Syrian Foxbats had photographed every Israeli position in northern Israel. They flew at 70,000 feet too high for Israeli Phantom jets to reach. They flew at Mach 2.5 too fast for Israeli missiles to catch. His pilots were the best in the world, his aircraft were among the most advanced, and he could do nothing. The Americans offered sympathy, but no solutions. Using the Belenko intelligence would require congressional approval. It would require coordination with multiple agencies. It would require time that Israel did not have. Then in December 1976, something changed everything. The first F-15 Eagles arrived in Israel. General Ivry watched the massive twin-tailed fighters land at Tel Nof Air Base and felt something he had not felt in months. Hope. These were not upgraded Phantoms or modified Mirages. These were purpose-built air superiority fighters designed from the ground up to destroy enemy aircraft. But the Eagles came with restrictions. American advisors insisted on extensive training periods. They demanded Israeli pilots follow American doctrine. They warned against aggressive tactics that might embarrass the new aircraft, or worse, result in one being captured by Soviet allies. Ivry listened politely. Then he called his best pilot into his office. Colonel Benny Peld had flown every fighter in Israeli inventory. He had combat kills in 3 wars. He had forgotten more about air combat than most pilots would ever learn. When Ivry showed him the classified American assessment of the MiG-25, Peled read it twice in silence. "They told us this aircraft was invincible," Peled said. "They said nothing could catch it. Nothing could kill it." "They were wrong," Ivry replied. "And now we are going to prove it. But not yet." Not until his pilots knew the F-15 like they knew their own hands. Not until they had developed tactics specifically designed to exploit Foxbat weaknesses. Not until they could guarantee success. Because failure was not an option. If an Israeli F-15 engaged a Syrian Foxbat and lost, the myth would become stronger than ever. Soviet propaganda would trumpet the victory across the world. Arab air forces would gain confidence. Israeli deterrence would crumble. They had one chance to get this right. Peled assembled a team of 4 pilots, all combat veterans. All men who had faced Soviet-built aircraft before and survived. They flew training missions in absolute secrecy, developing techniques that American advisors had never seen. The Americans taught beyond visual range combat as a textbook exercise. Detect the target, lock the radar, fire the missile, wait for impact, clean and surgical and safe. Israeli pilots added something the Americans had not considered: deception. They would not simply wait for Syrian Foxbats to appear. They would bait them. Israeli aircraft would fly patterns designed to attract Syrian attention. When the Foxbats launched to intercept F-15s, would be waiting at altitudes and positions the Syrians never expected. The key was the Foxbats' radar. Belenko had revealed it could barely detect fighter-sized targets beyond 50 kilometers. It was optimized for finding large bombers, not agile fighters, hiding in ground clutter. Israeli F-15s with their Hughes APG-63 radars could track targets at 150 kilometers. The math was simple. Israeli pilots would see the Foxbats long before the Foxbats saw them. They would launch missiles from ranges where Syrian radar showed nothing but empty sky. The first warning Syrian pilots would receive would be the moment their aircraft exploded. For 4 years, Peled's team trained in secret. They flew hundreds of simulated intercepts against Israeli aircraft, playing the role of Foxbats. They refined their tactics until every movement was automatic. They waited for the moment when political circumstances would allow them to strike. That moment came on February 13, 1981. Syrian Foxbats had grown bolder. They were no longer content with high-altitude reconnaissance. They were probing Israeli air defenses, testing response times, gathering electronic intelligence on Israeli radar frequencies. General Ivry decided the provocations had gone far enough. He authorized the first deliberate intercept of a MiG-25 Foxbat. Colonel Benny Zinker, commanding officer of 133 Squadron, received the mission briefing at 0600 hours. His target was a Syrian Foxbat, scheduled to conduct a reconnaissance flight over Lebanon's Bekaa Valley. Intelligence indicated the aircraft would cruise at 70,000 feet and Mach 2.35, following the standard profile Syrian pilots had used for months. Zinker would lead a flight of 2 F-15s. His wingman would provide backup if the first engagement failed. They would launch from Tel Nof, climb to 30,000 feet, and wait for the Syrian to appear on radar. The engagement parameters were precise. Fire only when the target was confirmed hostile. Fire only when probability of kill exceeded 90%. Fire only when there was zero chance of hitting civilian aircraft. And under no circumstances engage in visual range combat. The Foxbat's speed made close-range maneuvering unpredictable. A lucky Syrian pilot might escape and report what he had seen. The first the Syrians must know of Israeli F-15 capabilities was when their aircraft stopped existing. Zinker strapped into his cockpit at 1400 hours. The F-15's twin Pratt & Whitney engines roared to life, producing 47,000 pounds of thrust. He taxied to the runway, received clearance, and pushed his throttles forward. The Eagle leaped into the sky like a homesick angel. At 30,000 feet over northern Israel, Zinker activated his radar and began scanning. The APG-63 painted the sky in electronic precision, searching for the distinctive signature of a high-altitude, high-speed target. His wingman, flying 2 miles behind, maintained radio silence. For 20 minutes they saw nothing. Then at 1447 hours, a contact appeared at the edge of Zinker's radar scope. Bearing 035, range 90 kilometers. Altitude 70,000 feet. Speed Mach 2.35. The Syrian Foxbat, flying exactly where intelligence predicted, had no idea it was being watched. Zinker turned his aircraft toward the intercept point, climbing gradually to reduce the altitude differential. His radar maintained perfect lock despite the target's extreme speed. The fire control computer calculated launch parameters, countdown timers, probability assessments. At 50 kilometers, the Syrian radar should have detected the F-15. It did not. The Foxbat continued straight and level its pilot, confident in his invincibility. Soviet instructors had told him nothing could touch him at this altitude and speed. He had no reason to doubt them. At 40 kilometers, Zinker armed his AIM-7 Sparrow missiles. The radar-guided weapons had been modified by Israeli technicians to improve their high-altitude performance. They could hit targets moving at Mach 3. At 35 kilometers, still beyond the Foxbat's detection range, Zinker squeezed the trigger. 2 Sparrows dropped from the F-15's fuselage, their rocket motors igniting with blinding white fire. They accelerated to Mach 3.5 in seconds, climbing toward the Syrian aircraft at speeds the Foxbat could not outrun. The Syrian pilot's radar warning receiver was designed to detect threats from ahead. It never saw the missiles approaching from below and behind. The first Sparrow's proximity fuse detonated 20 feet from the MiG-25's left engine. Shrapnel from the continuous rod warhead shredded the turbine and punctured fuel tanks. The second missile, launched as insurance, passed through the expanding debris cloud and detonated near the cockpit. At Mach 2.35, aerodynamic forces are brutal. The damaged Foxbat began tumbling immediately. Its steel structure, never designed for violent maneuvering, twisted under loads it could not withstand. Pieces of tail section separated. The canopy blew away. Burning fuel traced a spiral path across the Lebanese sky. Israeli ground radar tracked the wreckage falling toward the Bekaa Valley. Zinker confirmed the kill on his radar, watching the target symbol fragment and disappear. The engagement from first detection to aircraft destruction had lasted 37 seconds. The Syrian pilot never fired a shot. He never saw his killer. He died believing he was untouchable. When Zinker landed at Tel Naf, General Ivry was waiting on the tarmac. The old fighter pilot veteran of 4 wars embraced the younger man without speaking. Around them, ground crews who had heard the radio transmissions cheered. 15 years of Soviet propaganda had died in half a minute, but the victory created an immediate problem. The Soviets knew their Foxbat had been destroyed. They did not know how. Syrian radar had not detected the Israeli fighters. Syrian ground observers had not seen the engagement. The MiG-25 had simply stopped transmitting and fallen from the sky. Moscow dispatched a technical investigation team to Damascus within hours. Engineers from the Mikoyan Design Bureau needed to understand what had happened. If the Americans had developed a weapon capable of killing Foxbat's Soviet air defense doctrine required complete revision. Israeli intelligence monitored the Soviet team's frantic activity with quiet satisfaction. Let them wonder. Let them question. Let them realize that everything they believed about their premier interceptor was wrong. Syrian pilots received new orders immediately. No more solo reconnaissance flights. No more high-altitude profiles that made them predictable. Foxbats would fly in pairs with fighter escorts. They would vary their altitudes and speeds. They would assume Israeli aircraft could appear anywhere. But these precautions came too late. Israeli pilots had proven the concept. They had killed the unkillable aircraft. And they were just getting started. Over the following months, Israeli F-15s engaged Syrian Foxbats 4 more times. Each engagement ended the same way. Israeli radar detected the target first. Israeli missiles launched first. Syrian pilots died without understanding what killed them. The kill ratio stood at 5-0. Soviet advisors in Damascus could not explain it. They checked the Foxbat systems. They reviewed pilot training. They analyzed radar data. Nothing made sense. Their aircraft were flying exactly as doctrine prescribed. Their pilots were following every procedure. Yet, they kept dying. What the Soviets did not know was that Israeli success had attracted attention far beyond the Middle East. Pentagon analysts watching the engagement reports with intense interest began revising their own estimates of Soviet capabilities. The MiG-25 was not just vulnerable to Israeli tactics. It was vulnerable to any modern air force using similar methods. The Foxbat myth was not just dying, it was being autopsied. But in June 1982, something happened that made individual Foxbat kills look like target practice. Syria moved 19 surface-to-air missile batteries into Lebanon's Bekaa Valley, creating what they believed was an impenetrable air defense network. Soviet advisors called it the most sophisticated SAM deployment outside the Soviet Union. Israeli commanders called it an opportunity. What followed would become the most one-sided air battle in jet age history. The kill ratio would reach numbers that defied military theory. Soviet generals would travel to Damascus personally to understand what went wrong. And the MiG-25 Foxbat, once feared by every Western Air Force, would become a symbol of Soviet aviation's complete failure. In Part 3, we will witness Operation Mole Cricket, 19, the day Israel destroyed not just aircraft, but an entire military doctrine. We will see 82 Syrian fighters fall from the sky, while 0 Israeli aircraft are lost. We will watch Soviet confidence shatter in real time. The Syrians thought 19 SAM batteries would protect them. They were catastrophically wrong. In Part 1, Viktor Belenko stole a MiG-25 Foxbat and exposed the greatest lie in Cold War aviation. In Part 2, Israeli F-15 pilots used that intelligence to kill the unkillable aircraft, shooting down Syrian Foxbats without losing a single plane. The kill ratio stood at 5-0. Soviet advisors in Damascus could not explain what was happening. But those early victories were just warm-up exercises. In June 1982, Syria deployed 19 surface-to-air missile batteries into Lebanon's Bekaa Valley. Soviet generals called it the most sophisticated air defense network outside the Soviet Union, SA-6. Gainful missiles, SA-8 Gecko systems. Radar installations covering every approach. Fighter squadrons on alert at bases throughout Syria. The message was clear. Come and try. We dare you. Israel accepted the challenge. What followed would become the most one-sided air battle in the history of jet aviation. The numbers would defy military theory. The kill ratio would reach levels that Soviet planners declared mathematically impossible, and the MiG-25 Foxbat would fall from the sky like burning rain. This was no longer an experiment. This was annihilation. The Soviet Union invested enormous resources into Syria's air defenses after the first Foxbat losses. Military advisors arrived from Moscow by the dozen. New radar systems were installed. Pilots received additional training based on Israeli tactics observed in previous engagements. The SA-6 missile batteries responsible for devastating Israeli aircraft in the 1973 war were positioned to create overlapping kill zones. Marshal Pavel Kutakov, commander of Soviet air forces, personally reviewed the Bekaa Valley deployment. He pronounced it impenetrable. Any Israeli aircraft attempting to attack would face missiles from multiple directions. Surviving aircraft would be met by MiG-25 interceptors and MiG-23 fighters scrambling from Syrian bases. The trap was set. The Soviets were confident. They had no idea what was coming. Israeli intelligence had spent months studying the Syrian deployment. They knew the location of every radar. They knew the frequency of every missile guidance system. They knew the response times of every fighter squadron. And they had developed a plan that would exploit every weakness Belenko's defection had revealed. Operation Mole Cricket 19 was not simply an airstrike. It was a demonstration. Israel would prove to the world that Soviet air defense doctrine was obsolete, that Soviet aircraft were inferior. That Soviet technology could not protect anyone against Western air power properly employed. The operation began on June 9, 1982, at 1400 hours. First came the drones. Israeli-built Mastiff and Scout unmanned aircraft flew directly toward the Syrian SAM batteries. The drones were cheap, expendable, and designed to look like manned aircraft on radar. Syrian operators, seeing what appeared to be an Israeli strike force, activated their radars and prepared to fire. This was exactly what Israel wanted. The moment Syrian radars went active, Israeli electronic warfare aircraft recorded every frequency. Within minutes, Israeli jammers began broadcasting interference that turned Syrian radar screens into useless static. Operators who had trained for years on Soviet equipment found themselves blind. Then the anti-radiation missiles arrived. Israeli F-4 Phantoms fired AGM-78 Standard and AGM-45 Shrike missiles that homed on radar emissions like sharks following blood. The missiles screamed down at Syrian positions, destroying radar antennas and killing operators before they could shut down their systems. 19 SAM batteries. 2 hours. All destroyed. Syria's air defense network, built over years with Soviet equipment and Soviet expertise, ceased to exist between lunch and dinner. Not a single Israeli aircraft was lost. But the SAM batteries were just the opening act. The real performance began when Syrian fighters scrambled to respond. MiG-25 Foxbats launched from Dumair Air Base near Damascus. MiG-23 Floggers scrambled from T4 Airfield. MiG-21 fishbeds rose from every available runway. Syrian commanders, furious at the destruction of their missile batteries, ordered every available aircraft into the sky. Israeli F-15 pilots were waiting for them. Captain Rafi Shafi spotted the first Syrian formation on his radar at 15:23 hours. 4 MiG-21s flying in tight formation, exactly as Soviet doctrine prescribed. Shafi locked his radar on the lead aircraft and fired an AIM-7 Sparrow missile from beyond visual range. The Syrian pilot never saw it coming. His wingman never saw his leader explode. By the time the surviving Syrians understood they were under attack, Shafi had already fired on the second aircraft. 3 MiG-21s destroyed in 45 seconds. Shafi did not break a sweat. Across the Bekaa Valley, similar engagements unfolded with terrifying precision. Israeli pilots trained to exploit the weaknesses Belenko had revealed executed textbook beyond visual range attacks. Syrian pilots trained by Soviet instructors using doctrine designed for a different kind of war died without ever seeing their killers. The MiG-25 Foxbats fared no better than their smaller cousins. Their speed, once considered invincible, became irrelevant against missiles that flew even faster. Their altitude advantage disappeared when Israeli radars tracked them from the moment they left the ground. Their primitive avionics gave no warning until moments before impact. Syrian pilot Colonel Hassan Khalil, flying a MiG-25 at 65,000 feet, believed he was safe. Israeli aircraft could not reach his altitude. Israeli missiles could not catch his speed. He had been told this his entire career. Then his radar warning receiver screamed. An AIM-7 Sparrow launched by an Israeli F-15. Flying 15,000 feet below him, was climbing toward his aircraft at Mach 3.5. Khalil pushed his throttles to maximum afterburner. The MiG-25 accelerated past Mach 2.5. It was not fast enough. The Sparrow's proximity fuse detonated 8 feet from his cockpit. Khalil's aircraft disintegrated at 65,000 feet, scattering wreckage across 20 square miles of Lebanese territory. By 1700 hours, the sky over the Bekaa Valley had become a graveyard. Israeli ground controllers tracking the engagement on radar watched Syrian aircraft disappear from their screens one by one. Each disappearance represented a fireball, a pilot dead or ejecting millions of dollars in Soviet equipment reduced to burning scrap metal. Captain Yoram Peled engaged a formation of 4 MiG-23s that were attempting to flank the Israeli strike force. He fired 4 missiles in 8 seconds. All 4 Syrians died. Lieutenant Amir Nachumi, flying his first combat mission, found himself facing a MiG-25 head-on. The Syrian pilot, following Soviet doctrine, attempted to use his speed advantage to disengage. Nachumi calmly adjusted his intercept angle and fired. The Foxbat exploded before its pilot could complete his turn. The Syrians fought with courage. They followed their training. They executed Soviet doctrine exactly as they had been taught. None of it mattered. By sunset on June 9th, Israeli pilots had shot down 29 Syrian aircraft. Israel lost nothing. The kill ratio was 29-0. Syrian commanders, desperate to stop the massacre, ordered more aircraft into the sky the following morning. MiG-25s, MiG-23s, and MiG-21s launched in waves determined to overwhelm Israeli defenses through sheer numbers. Soviet doctrine held that quantity could compensate for quality. Send enough aircraft, lose enough pilots, and eventually you would exhaust the enemy's missiles. The doctrine failed catastrophically. June 10th proved even more devastating than June 9th. Israeli F-15s and F-16s, operating in perfect coordination, destroyed Syrian formations before they could reach engagement range. Israeli AWACS aircraft orbiting safely over Israeli territory provided pilots with complete situational awareness. Every Syrian aircraft was tracked from takeoff to destruction. 44 more Syrian aircraft fell on the second day. Syrian pilot Captain Ahmad Hamad managed to survive both days. His testimony, given years later to military historians, revealed the psychological devastation Israeli tactics inflicted. We could not see them. We could not find them on radar. Our friends would explode beside us without warning. We followed every procedure, every tactic we had learned from Soviet instructors. Nothing worked. It was not combat. It was execution. By June 11th, the Syrian Air Force had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. 82 aircraft destroyed. 0 Israeli losses. The kill ratio stood at 82-0. Soviet Marshal Kutakov flew to Damascus personally to investigate. What he found shattered Soviet confidence in their entire military doctrine. Syrian pilots had done nothing wrong. They had followed Soviet training exactly. They had flown Soviet aircraft precisely as designed. They had employed Soviet tactics perfectly. And they had been slaughtered. The problem was not Syrian incompetence. The problem was Soviet technology. The problem was Soviet doctrine. The problem was everything the Soviet Union believed about air combat. Kutakov's report to the Soviet Defense Ministry, partially declassified after the Soviet collapse, contained devastating conclusions. Soviet aircraft were 15 to 20 years behind American capabilities. Soviet radars could not detect threats that American radars tracked easily. Soviet missiles could not hit targets that American missiles destroyed routinely. The MiG-25 Foxbat, once the pride of Soviet aviation, received particular criticism. Its speed meant nothing against beyond visual range missiles. Its altitude capability meant nothing against radars that tracked it from takeoff. Its primitive avionics meant pilots died without warning. Kutakov wrote that the Soviet Union had spent 30 years building the wrong air force. They had optimized for quantity when quality was what mattered. They had trained pilots for scenarios that no longer existed. They had believed their own propaganda until reality destroyed them over the Bekaa Valley. News of the Israeli victory spread rapidly through Western military circles. Pentagon analysts studying the engagement data realized the implications extended far beyond the Middle East. If Israeli pilots could achieve 82-0 against Soviet equipment and Soviet doctrine, American pilots could achieve similar results against any Soviet ally. The NATO alliance, which had spent decades preparing for a potential Soviet invasion of Western Europe, suddenly found its confidence transformed. Soviet numerical superiority in aircraft no longer seemed so threatening. Soviet pilots trained in Soviet doctrine would die just as Syrian pilots had died. The psychological impact on Soviet military planning was profound. Development of the MiG-29 and Su-27 fourth-generation fighters accelerated dramatically. Soviet designers acknowledged that matching American capabilities required abandoning their entire design philosophy. But new aircraft took years to develop. In the meantime, Soviet air forces faced the reality that their existing equipment was obsolete. Israeli pilot Amir Nachumi, interviewed decades later about Operation Mole Cricket 19, offered a simple summary of what happened. They believed speed would save them. They believed altitude would protect them. They believed numbers would overwhelm us. They were wrong about everything. The MiG-25 was not a fighter. It was a target with engines. The Bekaa Valley massacre transformed Viktor Belenko from a defector into a prophet. Everything he had told American intelligence in 1976 proved true 6 years later. The Foxbat was a paper tiger. Soviet doctrine was fatally flawed. Western technology was a generation ahead. But the statistics and the strategy tell only part of the story. Behind every number was a human being, a Soviet pilot who trained for years believing his aircraft was the best in the world, a Syrian pilot who climbed into a cockpit trusting equipment that could not protect him, engineers in Moscow who designed systems that failed catastrophically when tested in combat, and one man, Viktor Belenko, who risked everything to tell the truth. What happened to him after his defection? What legacy did his courage create? And what lessons did the world learn from the death of the Foxbat myth? In Part 4, we will follow Belenko's journey from Soviet traitor to American citizen. We will trace the collapse of Soviet aviation confidence from the Bekaa Valley to the fall of the Berlin Wall. We will examine how one desperate flight across the Sea of Japan changed the course of Cold War history. The Foxbat is dead. But the story of the man who killed it has one final chapter. Viết phần bổn phận cuối kịch bản video lịch sử quân sự. Thế chiến hai yêu cầu 2.500 đến 3.000. A desperate pilot steals the most feared fighter in the world. American engineers tear it apart and discover 15 years of lies. Israeli pilots use that knowledge to achieve the most one-sided air victory in jet age history. 82 Syrian aircraft destroyed. 0 Israeli losses. Soviet aviation doctrine exposed as fatally flawed. But what happened to the man who started it all? Viktor Belenko landed in Japan with 30 seconds of fuel remaining. He handed the Americans the greatest intelligence gift of the Cold War. His courage changed the course of military history. And then, he disappeared. For years, Belenko lived under a new identity, protected by the CIA, hidden from Soviet assassins who wanted him dead. The man who exposed the Foxbat myth became a ghost invisible even to the history he had helped create. This final chapter reveals what happened to Belenko after his dramatic defection. It traces the ripples of his courage from the Bekaa Valley massacre to the collapse of the Soviet Union itself. And it answers the question that matters most. Was it worth it? Because sometimes telling the truth costs everything. The Soviet Union sentenced Viktor Belenko to death in absentia. KGB agents received orders to eliminate the traitor by any means necessary. Soviet diplomatic pressure on Japan and the United States demanded his return. The Kremlin called him a criminal, a lunatic, a fabricator of lies about Soviet technology. None of it mattered. Belenko was beyond their reach. The CIA relocated him to the United States under a new identity. He received a substantial financial settlement enough to start a new life. He learned English, studied American culture, and tried to become invisible in a country that celebrated individualism. But invisibility proved difficult for a man whose defection had humiliated a superpower. Soviet intelligence tracked him constantly. In 1977, a car attempted to run him down on a Virginia highway. In 1979, his apartment was broken into, though nothing was stolen. The message was clear. The KGB had not forgotten. The KGB never forgave. Belenko moved repeatedly, changing addresses, changing names, changing everything except the memories of what he had done. He married an American woman, had children, built something resembling a normal life. But he never stopped looking over his shoulder. In 1980, he published a book titled MiG-Pilot, co-written with American journalist John Barron. The book detailed his life in the Soviet Union, his growing disillusionment, and his dramatic escape. It became a bestseller, translated into dozens of languages, read by millions who wanted to understand what drove a man to betray his country. Critics called it propaganda. Defenders called it truth. Belenko called it justice. The royalties from MiG-Pilot gave Belenko financial security. More importantly, the book gave him something he had lost: a voice. He was no longer a classified intelligence source hidden in CIA files. He was a public figure able to speak openly about Soviet lies and Western naivety. He testified before congressional committees. He consulted for aerospace companies. He lectured at military academies. The Soviet Air Force pilot who had once dreamed of flying became an American citizen who helped his adopted country understand its enemies. When Israeli F-15s achieved their 82-0 victory in the Bekaa Valley, Belenko watched the news coverage with quiet satisfaction. Everything he had told the Americans in 1976 had proven true 6 years later. The Foxbat was a paper tiger. Soviet doctrine was fatally flawed. The truth he had risked his life to reveal had saved countless lives by exposing Soviet weaknesses. But his legacy was not measured in Hunchung or newspaper headlines. The intelligence Belenko provided fundamentally altered American military strategy for the remainder of the Cold War. Before his defection, American planners assumed Soviet aircraft were technological equals. After his defection, they knew Soviet systems were a generation behind. This knowledge transformed procurement decisions worth hundreds of billions of dollars. The F-15 program, already successful, received additional funding because planners knew it could dominate Soviet fighters completely. The F-16 Fighting Falcon, designed as a lightweight complement to the Eagle, was built in quantities that reflected confidence in American technological superiority. The B-1 bomber program, nearly cancelled due to fears of Soviet interceptors, was revived because analysts understood the Foxbat could not actually threaten it. Strategic defense planning shifted from assumption of Soviet parity to exploitation of Soviet weakness. When the Persian Gulf War erupted in 1991, American F-15 pilots destroyed Iraqi MiG-25s using tactics developed from Belenko intelligence. The kill ratio mirrored Israeli success: 41 Iraqi aircraft destroyed with 0 American losses to enemy fighters. The total combat record of the F-15 Eagle now stands at 104 confirmed kills, 0 losses to enemy aircraft. This perfect record exists partly because Belenko revealed exactly what American pilots would face and exactly how to defeat it. But the F-15's success tells only part of the story. Soviet response to Belenko's defection and the Bekaa Valley massacre accelerated development of the MiG-29 Fulcrum and Su-27 flanker. These fourth-generation fighters finally gave Soviet pilots aircraft capable of competing with Western designs. They featured fly-by-wire controls, pulse Doppler radar, and beyond visual range missiles. The irony is profound. By exposing Soviet weaknesses, Belenko forced the Soviet Union to build better aircraft. His defection improved Soviet aviation even as it humiliated Soviet leadership. But the investment required to develop these new fighters strained an already struggling Soviet economy. Resources devoted to catching up with American aviation could not be spent on consumer goods infrastructure or the 1,000 other needs of Soviet citizens. The arms race that Belenko intensified helped bankrupt the Soviet system. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, military historians traced the collapse through many causes: economic stagnation, political ossification, the burden of maintaining global military commitments. But among those causes was a simple truth: the Soviet Union could not afford to keep lying about its capabilities. Belenko's defection revealed that Soviet military technology was not the equal of Western systems. The Bekaa Valley massacre proved it in combat. Every Soviet citizen who learned these truths, despite government propaganda, understood that their leaders had deceived them about far more than fighter aircraft. The lesson extends beyond military history into the nature of systems and innovation. The Soviet Union failed not because it lacked brilliant engineers or dedicated workers. Mikhail Gurevich, designer of the MiG-25, was a genius who solved impossible problems with available resources. Soviet test pilots displayed courage equal to any American counterpart. Individual talent existed throughout the Soviet aerospace industry. The system failed because it could not tolerate truth. When Belenko and his fellow pilots discovered the Foxbat's limitations, they could not report them honestly. Criticizing Soviet technology meant career destruction or imprisonment. So they remained silent, and their silence allowed lies to compound until reality intervened violently over the Bekaa Valley. American aviation succeeded not because American engineers were smarter, but because American systems tolerated criticism. When F-15 test pilots discovered problems, they reported them. When designs failed, engineers revised them. When doctrine proved flawed, commanders changed it. The difference between 82 to 0 and 0 to 82 was not talent. It was truth. This lesson resonates far beyond 1982. Every organization that punishes honesty eventually discovers its mistakes through catastrophe rather than correction. Every system that rewards loyalty over accuracy builds on foundations that will crumble when tested. Belenko risked everything to tell the truth about an aircraft. The Soviet Union collapsed partly because it could not handle that truth. The connection is not coincidental. It is causal, and there is one final detail that most histories overlook. In 2006, 30 years after his defection, Viktor Belenko returned to Russia. The Soviet Union that had sentenced him to death no longer existed. The KGB that had hunted him had been reorganized and renamed. The country he had betrayed had become something different, struggling toward democracy, grappling with its own history. Belenko traveled to Moscow as an American citizen visiting a foreign country. He walked the streets where he had once been a young pilot dreaming of flight. He visited museums that displayed Soviet aircraft, including the MiG-25 he had once piloted. Russian journalists asked why he had returned. His answer revealed more about the man than any classified debriefing. "I did not betray Russia. I betrayed lies. The Russia that exists today is not the Russia I fled. It is learning to tell the truth about its past. I wanted to see that country." Belenko found a nation still struggling with his legacy. Some Russians considered him a traitor who had damaged their country's prestige. Others viewed him as a hero who had exposed corruption and incompetence. The debate continues today, 4 decades after his flight across the Sea of Japan. But the facts are beyond dispute. One pilot's courage exposed the greatest deception in Cold War aviation history. One defection provided intelligence worth billions of dollars. One man's decision to tell the truth contributed to the downfall of a superpower. Viktor Belenko died in 2023 at the age of 76, an American citizen living quietly in the country that had given him refuge. Few obituaries noted his passing. The man who had changed history spent his final decades in comfortable obscurity. But his legacy flies today in every F-15 Eagle that takes to the sky. It echoes in every military academy that teaches the importance of accurate intelligence. It lives in every pilot who understands that propaganda is no substitute for performance. From a disillusioned Soviet lieutenant with nothing but courage and 30 seconds of fuel to the complete exposure of superpower deception. Viktor Belenko proved that truth properly delivered can defeat the mightiest lies. The MiG-25 Foxbat was supposed to be unstoppable. Soviet propaganda said so for 15 years. Western intelligence believed it. Pilots on both sides of the Iron Curtain accepted it as fact. One man knew better. One man risked everything to prove it. And because of his courage, 104 enemy aircraft have fallen to the fighter built to exploit the truth he revealed. The Foxbat myth died in 37 seconds over the Bekaa Valley. The lesson it teaches will last forever. Some lies are too big to survive contact with reality. Some truths are too important to remain hidden. And sometimes the most dangerous weapon in the world is not a missile or a fighter jet. It is a single person willing to tell the truth when everyone else is lying. That is the legacy of Viktor Belenko. That is the story of how the F-15 killed the MiG-25 myth. And that is why this story deserves to be remembered not just as military history, but as a reminder of what courage and honesty can accomplish against impossible odds. If you know similar stories of innovation and truth changing the course of history, share them in the comments. This is just one of hundreds of moments when individual courage transformed the world. Subscribe to discover more hidden histories that shaped the world we live in today. Because the most powerful force in human affairs is not weapons, or wealth, or political power. It is the truth spoken by someone brave enough to speak it.